Wyoming Territory, 1874. The cold wind tore at her thin shawl as Bonnie Prescott stumbled down the rocky trail, breathless and wild-eyed, the bruises on her arms burning with every step. She did not dare look back toward the distant ranch house where her father's voice still echoed in her ears, full of rage and threats. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart pounding with terror and hope. Ahead, the lights of Willow Creek flickered through the trees like a promise. Bonnie gritted her teeth and pushed on. She had heard whispers in town about the blacksmith there, a man strong enough to hammer steel but kind enough to mend a child's broken toy without asking for a penny. She prayed those whispers were true. She prayed he would not turn her away. The town was quiet when she reached it, the sky stretched wide and black overhead. Only the forge was alive, firelight spilling out into the street. Bonnie hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the door to the smithy. Inside, the heat wrapped around her like a blanket. Sparks hissed and danced in the air, and there he was. A tall man stood at the anvil, his sleeves rolled up, dark hair damp with sweat. His arms were thick with muscle, and his brown eyes, when they lifted to meet hers, were soft in a way that almost broke her. "Miss." His voice was low and careful, like he was afraid to scare her off. "You lost." Bonnie opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Tears threatened, and she shook her head fiercely, clutching the edge of the door like a drowning sailor clinging to wreckage. The blacksmith wiped his hands on a rag and stepped closer. He did not crowd her, kept a respectful distance, but there was a steadiness about him that made her want to weep. "My name's Silas Everett," he said gently. "You need help." The kindness in his voice undid her. A sob broke free and she nodded, pressing her fists to her mouth to stay quiet. Silas moved slow, like a man approaching a spooked horse. "Come on in, sit by the fire. Nobody's gonna hurt you here." Bonnie followed him in, drawn by the warmth and the way he spoke, like she was someone worth speaking to kindly. She sank onto a wooden bench near the forge, holding her hands out to the flames. Silas crouched down to her level. "You hungry?" She nodded again. He disappeared into a back room and returned with a plate of bread and cheese. Bonnie ate like she had not seen food in days. Maybe she had not. Silas said nothing, just worked at the anvil, stealing glances at her when he thought she was not looking. When she finished, Bonnie wiped her hands on her skirt and found the courage to speak. "My father, he wanted to marry me off to a man twice my age. When I said no, he—" She stopped, her voice cracking. Silas's jaw tightened. He did not ask for details. He just nodded once, like he understood all she had left unsaid. "You can stay here," he said. "For now, until you figure what you want to do." She stared at him. "You do not even know me." "Do not need to," he said simply. "You need help. That is enough." Bonnie pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the sudden, fierce relief that crashed over her. Silas set up a cot for her in a small side room, offering her a battered quilt and a soft word of comfort. When he closed the door behind him, Bonnie sat on the cot, clutching the quilt like it was the only thing tying her to this new, fragile world. That night, she slept without fear for the first time in years. The days that followed were quiet but full. Bonnie helped where she could, sweeping the shop, fetching water, handing Silas tools while he worked. She learned quickly that he was a man of few words but endless patience. One morning, Bonnie brought him a cup of coffee where he stood hammering out a horseshoe. His hands were blackened with soot and a smear of ash streaked his cheek. He smiled when he saw her, a real one that made her chest ache. "Thank you, Bonnie." She smiled back, feeling something warm unfurl in her chest. Later, as she mended a tear in one of Silas's shirts by the fire, Bonnie glanced up to find him watching her. There was a look in his eyes she could not quite name, something protective, something tender. "You do not need to keep working so hard," he said. "You are a guest." "I want to," she said. "I feel useful." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right, long as you know you do not owe me anything." "I know," Bonnie whispered. She did not say that she wanted to stay, that the thought of leaving twisted her stomach into knots. She did not say that every time Silas smiled at her, she felt safer, stronger. But she thought maybe he knew anyway, One afternoon, Bonnie stood outside the smithy, hanging laundry, when she saw a rider galloping into town. Her heart seized when she recognized the man, one of her father's hired hands, a brute named Wade who had always leered at her too long. He spotted her. His grin widened. "Found you, girl," he called out, swinging down from his horse. "Your daddy's been looking real hard." Bonnie backed away, blood roaring in her ears. Silas was inside, pounding iron. She had to get to him. Wade lunged, grabbing her arm hard enough to bruise. Bonnie cried out, struggling. The forge doors crashed open. Silas was there in an instant, fists clenched, eyes blazing. "Let her go," he said, voice low and dangerous. Wade laughed. "This ain't your business, Blacksmith." Silas moved. One moment he was standing still, the next he had Wade by the collar, yanking him away from Bonnie. He punched Wade hard enough to send him sprawling into the dirt. "You touch her again," Silas said, standing over him, "and you will not walk away." Wade scrambled up, spitting blood. He glared at Bonnie, then at Silas. "This ain't over." Silas stepped forward, and Wade thought better of it. He mounted his horse and rode off at a gallop. Bonnie stood frozen, shaking. Silas turned to her, his face softening. "You all right?" She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Without thinking, she threw herself into his arms. Silas caught her easily, holding her tight against his chest. His hand rubbed slow circles over her back, and Bonnie buried her face against him, breathing in the scent of smoke and iron and safety. "I have got you," he murmured into her hair. "I swear it, Bonnie, I will keep you safe, no matter what." For the first time in her life, she believed it. And deep inside her, something bloomed, something fierce and bright and full of hope. The morning after Wade's threat, Silas hitched his wagon before the sun lifted the mist from the valley. Bonnie stood nearby, her hands twisting the hem of her borrowed skirt, watching as he loaded the few tools he would need for the trip. When he noticed her worry, he set down the coiled rope he was carrying. "Come with me," he said, voice steady as the earth. "Town council's meeting today. I want them to hear what happened." Bonnie hesitated, glancing down at her worn boots. Silas waited, patient as always. She nodded and climbed into the wagon, settling on the rough bench beside him. As they rode along the rutted road, the cold air bit at her cheeks, but she found herself drawing strength from the way Silas kept one hand firm on the reins and the other resting loosely near his side, ready if she needed him. At Willow Creek's meeting hall, men gathered in a loose circle, their faces lined with sun and wind. They looked up as Silas entered, Bonnie close behind. A few tipped their hats to her, but most watched with the cautious reserve of men weighing stories before choosing sides. Silas addressed them plainly, recounting Wade's attack without embellishment. Bonnie kept her gaze on the floorboards, feeling their judgment like heat against her skin. When he finished, an older man with silver hair and a badge pinned crookedly to his vest spoke. "That girl's under your protection, Everett?" Silas's answer cut through the room like a blade. "She is." The men murmured among themselves. Finally, the sheriff stepped forward. "Then she's under ours too. Wade comes sniffing around again, he won't find a welcome." Relief loosened the tightness in Bonnie's chest. She dared to glance up and met the sheriff's steady gaze. He gave her a small nod, nothing showy, but it felt like a door opening. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, spilling gold over the street. Silas helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingering at her elbow a heartbeat longer than necessary. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said. "I'm not," Bonnie answered, surprising herself with the truth of it. They walked back toward the smithy, boots crunching over gravel. A few townsfolk greeted them, a woman pressing a small bundle of biscuits into Bonnie's hands with a shy smile. Bonnie thanked her, cheeks warming. Later, as Silas hammered out a plowshare, Bonnie sat nearby sewing a patch onto a pair of work pants. The fire's glow painted the walls in shades of copper and deep orange. Without looking up, Silas asked, "You ever think what you want to do now?" Bonnie paused, needle hovering above the cloth. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never thought I'd have a choice." "You do," Silas said. The rhythm of his hammering slowed, then stopped altogether. He turned, leaning on the anvil. If you wanted, you could stay. Bonnie's heart leapt against her ribs. She set down the pants carefully, smoothing the fabric with trembling fingers. I wouldn't be a burden. You're not now, and you wouldn't be then, Silas said. The forge crackled between them, filling the silence. Bonnie met his eyes, searching for any trace of pity or obligation. She found none, only quiet steadiness and something gentler still. I can work, she said, voice low but firm. I can learn whatever you need. Silas gave a slow nod, as if he had already known her answer. You'll have your own wage, he said. Your own say. No one tells you otherwise. Bonnie blinked hard against sudden tears, swallowing them down. She remembered too many nights when her voice had meant nothing. Thank you, she said. Silas only nodded again, picking up his hammer. The sound of iron meeting iron rang out, sure and strong. Days passed with the slow rhythm of honest work. Bonnie learned to tend the forge's fire, to oil the tools, to measure lengths of chain and hammer out small nails. Her muscles ached at night, but it was a good ache, earned by her own hands. One evening, after the sun dipped low and the sky flared with color, Bonnie carried a basket of fresh kindling into the smithy. Silas was cleaning the anvil, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, the light catching in his dark hair. She hesitated, then crossed the room, setting the basket down. Silas, she said, voice soft. Why are you helping me? He wiped his hands on a rag, considering her. My ma was like you, he said finally. Ran from worse than what you left behind. Town took her in. Folks gave her a chance, figured it's my turn to do the same. Bonnie looked at him, really looked. Saw the way the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened when he smiled, the way he carried his own history in the set of his shoulders. You're a good man, she said. Silas shrugged, almost shy. Just trying to be. Bonnie smiled then, a small, true thing. For the first time, she no longer felt like a ghost haunting her own life. She felt real. And when Silas smiled back, she thought maybe she could be something more than just safe. Maybe she could be happy. The first real snow came early that year, blanketing Willow Creek in heavy silence. Bonnie woke to the thick hush of it. The world outside the smithy softened under a sky the color of pewter. She wrapped herself in the shawl Mrs. Hart from the mercantile had gifted her and stepped outside, the cold biting at her nose and cheeks. Silas was already out front, shoveling a path to the forge. His hair was damp with melting flakes, his coat dusted white. When he saw her, he leaned on his shovel and offered a nod, his breath misting in the chill air. You ever seen snow this deep? He asked. Only once, Bonnie said, tucking the shawl tighter around her shoulders. I was a girl, thought the world had disappeared under it. Silas chuckled low in his throat. Feels that way sometimes. She watched him work, the easy strength in his movements, the way he cleared the path without complaint. It stirred something inside her, something warm and yearning she did not fully understand yet. Later, while Silas tended to the forge, Bonnie swept the shop floor clean of tracked in mud and snow. Around midday, he set down his tongs, wiped his hands, and glanced her way. You ever ride? He asked. Bonnie looked up from the broom. A little, on a mule mostly. Horses were for men in my father's house. Silas reached for his coat. Come on, got something to show you. She followed him to the small paddock behind the smithy where a sturdy bay mare stood, her breath steaming. Silas offered Bonnie the reins. Name's Juniper, she's steady. Bonnie hesitated, then took the leather in her gloved hands. Juniper snuffed her palm, warm and curious. Silas boosted her up with a practiced lift, his hands firm but careful, and Bonnie settled into the saddle, a little stiff but grinning despite herself. Silas led her around the paddock, giving quiet instructions. Bonnie listened closely, adjusting her seat, loosening her grip. After a few circuits, he let go and stepped back. You're a natural, he said, watching her with open pride. The praise made her sit taller. She guided Juniper around the paddock, laughing when the mare tossed her head playfully. When she dismounted, Bonnie handed the reins back, cheeks flushed from more than the cold. Silas rubbed Juniper's neck and glanced at Bonnie, his voice a little rougher than usual. Had a thought. Might be good to ride out sometimes, teach you the trails. If you're gonna stay, you ought to know the land. Bonnie nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle warmly inside her. Stay. He said it like it was a given now. As the afternoon faded, they worked side by side in comfortable silence. Bonnie stitched a new apron for Silas, her needle moving steady through the thick cloth, while he repaired a wagon wheel, his hammer ringing sharp and true. When dusk fell, they shared a simple supper of stew and bread. Afterward, Bonnie lingered near the fire, watching the flames dance. Silas sat across from her, a worn book open in his lap. "You read much?" he asked. "Not often. My mother taught me some before she passed." Silas nodded thoughtfully. "I've got a few books, mostly about farming and smithing. There's a storybook, though, found it last year in Cheyenne." He rose and crossed to a small shelf, pulling down a thin, battered volume. He held it out to her. "Take it. Might help pass the nights." Bonnie accepted it carefully, like it was something precious. The cover was faded, the edges worn, but inside the words were clear enough. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas's mouth lifted in a slow, genuine smile. "Anything you need, Bonnie, you just say." She hugged the book to her chest, feeling the truth of his words settle deep. No one had ever made her a promise like that and meant it. Outside, the snow kept falling, muffling the world. Inside, the forge's fire burned steady, and Bonnie let herself believe for the first time that she might be building something lasting here, not just shelter, a home. The snow deepened over the next weeks, muffling hoofbeats and softening the sharp edges of the frontier town. Bonnie learned to move through it in Silas's old boots, 2 pairs of socks rolled tight around her toes to keep the cold from biting too deep. On a gray afternoon, as she folded new iron nails into burlap sacks, Silas came in from the cold, dusted with snow. He shook it from his coat and pulled off his gloves, his face red from the wind. "I've been thinking," he said, setting a small wooden box on the workbench. Bonnie wiped her hands on her apron and came closer. "I've got a cousin, lives out near Laramie. He runs cattle. Could use another hand come spring," Silas said. "I was thinking, if you wanted, you could come with me when I visit, meet some folks. See more than just Willow Creek." She traced the grain of the worn wood with her fingertip, her heart beating faster. "I would like that," she said. "I've never been farther than a day's ride." Silas leaned his hip against the bench, studying her. "You're not bound to stay tucked away here, Bonnie. You've got the whole world out there if you want it." She looked up at him, the forge light catching the earnestness in his face. "Maybe I want this world," she said softly. His lips parted like he meant to answer, but he only nodded, a slow, certain movement. That night, after the forge fire was banked and the streets outside lay silent under the snow, Bonnie sat near the hearth, the book he had given her resting open on her lap. Silas whittled a bit of pine by the window, the blade flashing in the lamplight. "Silas," she said, her voice low, "what made you stay here all these years?" He shaved a curl of wood away before answering. "Had my share of wandering. Thought towns like this deserved someone who'd stay put, do the hard work." Bonnie closed the book, listening to the knife whisper through the wood. "You never wanted more." He set the carving down, a rough little horse, its legs still crude, and turned to face her fully. "I want what's honest. A roof that holds, work that matters, someone to come home to at the end of the day." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Bonnie's mouth went dry. She rose from her chair, the heavy quilt slipping from her knees, and crossed to him. "I could be that someone," she said, the words a tremulous offering. Silas's eyes searched hers, slow and careful, as if giving her every chance to change her mind. When she didn't flinch, didn't look away, he reached out and took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm despite the chill lingering in the room. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded, her throat too thick for words. He squeezed her fingers gently, as if anchoring both of them to the moment. "We'll do this right, Bonnie," he said. "Proper?" She smiled, the first real, unguarded smile she'd felt in years. "I know we will." The next morning, Silas hitched the wagon to Juniper and drove them to the Reverend's modest house near the edge of town. Bonnie wore her best dress, a simple blue calico Mrs. Hart had helped her hem, and Silas wore his cleanest shirt. the one with the mended cuffs. They stood before the reverend, Bonnie's hand tucked safely in Silas's broad one, and spoke vows so simple and earnest they hardly needed saying aloud. When the reverend pronounced them man and wife, Silas turned to her, his expression fierce and tender all at once. He kissed her forehead, a lingering, reverent touch that made Bonnie's heart shudder in her chest. They rode home through the snow, the sky heavy with the promise of another storm, but Bonnie felt only warmth. Silas helped her down from the wagon, his hand firm at her waist. Inside the smithy he paused, shutting the door against the wind. The forge had gone cold, but Bonnie didn't feel the chill. She stood in the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs, unsure what came next. Silas crossed the space between them, cupping her cheek in his broad hand. "You're safe now," he murmured. "Always." Bonnie leaned into him, closing her eyes, letting herself believe it. He kissed her then, slow and certain, his hand steady at the small of her back. Bonnie rose onto her toes, pressing closer, feeling the solid truth of him against her. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "We'll build a life here," he said. "Strong and steady, like the work we do." Bonnie smiled, tears bright in her eyes but unshed. "I want nothing else." Outside, the snow fell thick and silent, blanketing the town in white. Inside, Bonnie and Silas stood together, the forge cold but their hearts blazing bright, ready to kindle a future forged in kindness, patience, and a love as enduring as iron. The last of winter ebbed away in slow drifts, the hard-packed snow receding from the streets of Willow Creek and leaving behind mud and the first stubborn shoots of green. Bonnie stood on the smithy's stoop one morning, breathing in the rich, thawing scent of earth. The world was waking up around her, and for the first time she felt she was waking with it. Inside, Silas was fitting new iron bands to a wagon wheel, sleeves rolled past his elbows, his brow furrowed in concentration. Bonnie carried over a tin cup of coffee, careful not to spill. "You think we'll have enough work come spring?" she asked, offering it to him. Silas took it with a grateful nod and sipped before answering. "Plenty. Folks will be fixing up after the winter. Wagons, plows, hinges. Always something needs tending once the thaw hits." She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe I could learn to do more." Silas's eyes warmed. "You could help with the shoeing, if you don't mind getting stepped on now and again." Bonnie laughed, the sound light and sure. "I reckon I'll survive." They spent the day preparing the shop, cleaning soot-blackened walls and oiling tools that had stiffened from the cold. Bonnie scrubbed the windows until the glass gleamed, sunlight spilling bright across the floorboards for the first time in months. Later, Silas brought in a battered table from the storage shed behind the smithy. He set it down near the forge, his boots thudding against the wood floor. "Thought we could use a place to sit proper," he said, adjusting its legs until it stood steady. Bonnie fetched a cloth she had hemmed from spare flour sacks and laid it across the tabletop. She placed a clay jar in the center, filling it with pine sprigs and a few wildflowers she had found bravely blooming near the creek. Silas watched her, his mouth curving into a smile that settled deep in his eyes. "You make it feel like a home," he said. Bonnie pressed a hand to the jar to steady it, feeling her cheeks warm. "It is a home, ours." The words hung between them, full and certain. That evening, Silas finished shaping a new set of hinges for the schoolhouse door, and Bonnie mended a torn saddlebag for the town's livery owner. When the last light faded, they sat across from each other at the new table, sharing a meal of salt pork and beans, with a small loaf of bread Bonnie had baked that morning. Silas reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His thumb brushed slow circles over her knuckles, the roughness of his skin a comfort. "I was thinking," he said, his voice low, "come summer we could build a little place, just ours. Something with a root cellar and a porch." Bonnie's breath caught. "You mean it?" He squeezed her hand gently. "I do. You deserve more than living above a forge." She shook her head, smiling through the tears that pricked her eyes. "I've got more already. I've got you." They rose together, the fire casting long shadows along the walls. Silas pulled her close, his arms a solid band around her waist. She rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. "I love you, Bonnie," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "I reckon I've loved you from the first moment you stepped through that door." She tipped her face up to him, her own heart full to bursting. "I love you too, Silas, with everything I am." He kissed her then, slow and sure, like he had all the time in the world. Bonnie melted into him, the world outside falling away until there was nothing but the two of them and the bright, fierce thing they had built with their own hands. Spring turned to summer, and the smithy thrived. Bonnie learned to shoe a horse steady as any hand, her small frame moving sure and confident among the animals. Silas taught her how to twist iron into delicate shapes, and she fashioned a set of sturdy hooks for their new home. With the help of a few townsfolk, they raised a small house on a gentle rise overlooking Willow Creek. Bonnie planted a little garden out back, rows of beans and squash sprouting under her careful tending. Silas built her a rocking chair for the front porch, carving her name into the armrest with quiet pride. In the evenings, they sat side by side, watching the sun sink behind the hills, the air thick with the scent of warm earth and wild grass. Bonnie would lean her head against Silas's shoulder, her hand resting over his heart, feeling its steady, familiar rhythm. Their life was not grand, but it was full to the brim with the things that mattered. Honest work, steady love, and the kind of peace that came from knowing they had chosen each other freely and forever. As the stars blinked awake overhead and the soft hum of crickets rose from the fields, Bonnie closed her eyes, breathing in the warm, clean scent of Silas beside her. She had found her place in the world. And she knew, with a certainty as deep as the roots of the hills around them, that she would never be lost again.